My parents gutted my bakery because I refused to pay my brother's $1.5 million debt. But what they didn't know was that I had already discovered where that money went. Have you ever given your family everything you could only to realize they believed you owed them even more? I never imagined my own parents would come after the one thing I had built entirely by myself. My name is Peyton, and for years, my bakery was my pride, my livelihood, and the proof that I could build something without anyone rescuing me. Then my brother Mason's business collapsed under $1.5 million in debt, and my parents decided my bakery should become his way out. I refused. They called me selfish. They begged. They pressured me. And when I still wouldn't surrender what I had worked for, they did something I never thought my family was capable of. They gutted my bakery. But that wasn't the part that shocked me most. It was what I discovered afterward that made me realize this had never really been about Mason's debt. I didn't know it then, but that morning in my empty bakery was only the beginning. Standing among the bare shelves and silent counters, I kept thinking about one question. Why would my parents go this far for Mason? They had always protected him, but destroying my business felt different. This wasn't an argument over money anymore. This was something deliberate. And to understand why, I have to take you back to before the bakery was gutted. Before the $1.5 million debt. Before my parents decided my hard work belonged to my brother. Mason had always been the family member everyone made excuses for. When we were younger, my parents used to tell me that Mason was simply finding himself. If he changed jobs 3 times in 1 year, he was finding himself. If he borrowed money and forgot to pay it back, he was going through a difficult period. If one of his business ideas failed, Dad would tell me, "Your brother just needs another chance." I learned very early that Mason got chances. I got responsibilities. I didn't resent him for being different from me. What hurt was watching my parents treat his mistakes like temporary accidents while expecting me to be perfect, because I usually was. I was the daughter who remembered birthdays, paid bills on time, showed up when someone needed help, and never called Mom and Dad asking them to fix my problems. And eventually that became my role in the family. The reliable one. The strong one. The one who supposedly didn't need anything. My bakery started small. I didn't have investors waiting behind me or parents offering a huge check. I started with a tiny rented kitchen and a handful of recipes I had spent years perfecting. I woke up before sunrise, baked until my feet hurt, delivered orders myself, cleaned everything afterward, and then did it all again the next morning. There were months when I wasn't sure the business would survive. But slowly customers came back. Then they started bringing friends. Then local offices began ordering breakfast trays. Then I hired my first employee. The day I finally signed the lease for my own storefront, I sat in my car afterward and cried. Not because I was sad. Because for the first time I had something that was completely mine. I named it simply because I didn't want some fancy name to hide what it was. It was my bakery. My work. My risk. My future. My parents were proud of me, or at least they acted proud. Dad would tell neighbors about my success. Mom would brag about how hardworking I was. But whenever Mason needed something, their attention shifted immediately. And I had learned not to complain. Then Mason started another business. He was convinced it was going to be different this time. He talked about expansion, investors, equipment, contracts, and how much money he was going to make. I listened. I even wished him well. But I didn't invest. I'd already learned that there was a difference between supporting someone emotionally and financing their bad decisions. For almost a year, Mason's business appeared to be doing fine. Then one Tuesday evening, Mom called me. Her voice sounded strange. Not sad exactly. "Peyton, can you come over tomorrow? Is everything okay? We need to talk about Mason." My stomach tightened. I asked what had happened. Mom wouldn't tell me over the phone. That should have been my first warning. The next afternoon I drove to my parents' house. Mason was already sitting at the kitchen table. Dad sat beside him. Mom had placed a folder in front of them. I remember looking at that folder and thinking, this is going to cost me something. I just didn't know how much. Dad opened it. "Mason's business is in trouble." I looked at my brother. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "How much trouble?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Dad said the number. $1.5 million. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? His total debt and obligations are around $1.5 million. I stared at Mason. He finally looked up. I didn't think it would get this bad. That sentence bothered me more than the number. Not I made a mistake. Not I'm sorry. Just, I didn't think it would get this bad. I asked what they expected me to do. Mom reached across the table and touched my hand. We need to talk about the bakery. I pulled my hand back. What about it? Dad leaned forward. You have a successful business. You have assets. You have cash reserves. I felt something inside me go cold. You want me to give Mason money? Not give, Mom said quickly. Help. There was that word. Help. Families can hide almost anything behind that word. I asked how much. Dad told me they needed a large amount immediately to keep Mason from losing everything. I looked at Mason. Why don't you sell your own assets? His expression changed. I don't have enough. That wasn't an answer. I looked at Dad. And why is this my responsibility? Dad frowned. Because you're his sister. I almost laughed. That's when I understood what they were really asking. They weren't asking whether I could help. They had already decided I should. My bakery had become their emergency fund. I told them no. Mom's face fell. Peyton, please. No. Just think about what you're saying. I have thought about it. Dad's voice hardened. Your brother could lose everything. I looked at Mason. He built the business. He took the loans. He signed the agreements. I didn't. Mason finally spoke. You don't understand what I'm dealing with. I looked at him for a long moment. Then explain it to me. He couldn't. Instead he started talking about pressure, employees, creditors, bad timing, and how one more opportunity could turn everything around. I'd heard versions of that speech before. And every time someone else paid the price. This time my parents wanted it to be me. I told them I was sorry, but I wasn't putting my bakery at risk. Mom's eyes filled with tears. You would really let your own brother suffer? That question stayed with me. Not because it changed my mind. Because it showed me exactly how they saw me. If I refused, I was cruel. If I agreed, I was loving. There was no version where my sacrifice wasn't expected. I stood up. I love you both. But I am not paying a $1.5 million debt I didn't create. Dad slammed his palm against the table. You've always been selfish when money is involved. That hurt. Not because it was true. Because I had spent years proving the opposite. I reminded him that when the bakery first opened, I worked 7 days a week. When Mom needed help with her house, I was there. When Mason needed money 2 years earlier, I had given him what I could. I had helped. Again and again. But apparently none of it counted because this time I had finally said no. I left that afternoon believing the argument would eventually cool down. It didn't. Over the next few days the calls became more frequent. Mom cried. Dad lectured. Mason sent long messages about how I was the only person who could save him. Then came the guilt. You'll regret this. You'll destroy your family. What kind of sister watches her brother lose everything? I stopped answering. I thought silence would make things easier. Instead, it gave them time to make their own decision. 3 days later, Mason called me. His voice sounded unusually calm. You're really not going to help? No. There was a pause. Then he said something that I couldn't stop thinking about. Fine. If you won't help me voluntarily, Mom and Dad will figure something out. What does that mean? You'll see. He hung up. I sat in my office at the bakery staring at my phone. For the first time I felt afraid. Not of Mason, but my parents. Because suddenly I understood something I hadn't wanted to believe. They weren't trying to convince me anymore. They were planning something. And I had no idea what. 2 mornings later I arrived at the bakery before sunrise. I noticed something strange immediately. One of the storage room locks looked different. I stood there staring at it. Then I checked the office. A folder was missing. It contained copies of my equipment purchases and some older business documents. I called my manager. She hadn't touched anything. My heart began beating faster. I went through the security system. There was footage from the previous evening. And when I saw who had entered my bakery, my hands went completely still. It was my father. And he wasn't alone. My mother was with him. They had walked through my bakery after closing. They had gone directly toward the equipment room. And they had stayed there for almost an hour. I watched the footage twice. Then a third time. I didn't call them. I didn't confront them. Instead I saved the footage. Because something told me this was bigger than Mason's $1.5 million debt. And if my parents were willing to enter my business behind my back, I needed to find out exactly what they were trying to take before I made my next move. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the security footage on my laptop, watching my parents walk through my bakery as if they belonged there. Dad had his keys. Mom carried an empty cardboard box. Neither of them looked nervous. That was what bothered me most. They weren't acting like two parents who had made a mistake. They looked like people who believed they had every right to be there. I opened the business records on my computer and started going through everything I could find. The lease, the equipment invoices, the bank statements, the original purchase agreements. Every document had the same story. The bakery belonged to me, not my parents, not Mason, me. I had paid for the equipment. I had signed the lease. I had built the business. So why had my parents entered after closing? And why had Mom brought boxes? The next morning I called my father. He answered on the second ring. Peyton, what were you doing at my bakery last night? There was a pause. Then he sighed. We were trying to help. By going into my business without telling me? You're being dramatic. I stared at the phone. Dad, I have security footage. Another pause. This one was longer. We're your parents, he finally said. You don't need to treat us like criminals. I didn't say you were criminals. I asked why you were there. He became defensive immediately. He said they had been checking what equipment could be sold to help Mason. I felt my stomach drop. You were planning to sell my equipment? Not permanently. What does that even mean? He started talking about emergencies and family sacrifices, but I stopped listening. Because suddenly everything made sense. They had already decided that my refusal didn't matter. They had decided my bakery was part of Mason's solution. I told Dad that if he entered the bakery again without my permission, I would handle it through the proper channels. He laughed. You really want to do this to your own family? I answered quietly. You already did it to me. Then I hung up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to make my parents understand my feelings. I was protecting myself. That afternoon I started digging into Mason's finances. I didn't have access to his private accounts and I wasn't going to do anything illegal to get them. But Mason had spent years talking about his businesses, his properties, and his investments. I remembered conversations I'd barely paid attention to. I remembered him mentioning a commercial property. I remembered Dad once saying Mason had moved things around before the business problems became public. At the time I hadn't thought anything of it. Now I did. I started putting together every piece of information I legitimately had. And then I found something. A property Mason had owned through his business had been transferred shortly before he admitted he was in serious financial trouble. I stared at the date. It was only weeks before my parents first asked me for money. That couldn't be a coincidence. I kept digging. Another asset had changed ownership. Then another. Mason wasn't completely empty-handed. He had been protecting something. I called my mother. Mom, how much of Mason's property was transferred before the business failed? Silence. Then she said, I don't know what you're talking about. You knew he was moving assets. No, I didn't. You and Dad went to my bakery. That has nothing to do with Mason's finances. Then why were you there? She hung up. That was the moment I knew I was onto something. The next morning I met with a business attorney. I brought every document I had. The attorney listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked through the paperwork and asked one question. Did you authorize your parents to remove any of this property? No. Do they own any part of the business? No. Are they listed on the lease? No. She nodded. Then document everything. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Not revenge. Not threats. Documentation. I secured the security footage. I made copies of my receipts. I photographed every piece of damaged property. I backed up the bakery's financial records. And I changed every access code. I thought that would finally stop them. I was wrong. 3 mornings later, I arrived at the bakery and immediately knew something had happened. The front door was locked. But inside the place looked wrong. One of the large display cases was gone. Then I looked toward the kitchen. The commercial mixer was missing. 2 ovens were gone. The refrigerator had been emptied. Boxes that had once held my specialty ingredients were scattered across the floor. My hands began to shake. I walked farther inside. The shelves had been stripped. The office drawers were open. My bakery looked like someone had taken everything valuable and left the rest behind. I stood there in complete silence. I had spent years imagining what failure might look like. I had never imagined it would look like this. For a few seconds I couldn't move. Then I noticed something on the counter. A note. 3 words. Family comes first. I knew immediately who had written it. I called my father. He answered calmly. Did you get our message? What did you do? We took what was necessary. You stole from me. We borrowed equipment. You emptied my bakery. We're trying to save your brother. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother's debt has nothing to do with my bakery. It has everything to do with family. No, I said. It has everything to do with choices. Dad became angry. He told me Mason was drowning and that I had money sitting inside a business while my own brother was facing financial ruin. I asked him one question. If Mason has nothing, why were his assets transferred before the collapse? He went silent. Completely silent. I knew then. He knew. Maybe not every detail. But he knew enough. I hung up. That afternoon Mason finally called. I almost didn't answer. Peyton, please. What? Can we talk? You've had plenty of chances to talk. I didn't know Mom and Dad were going to do this. Did you know they were moving your assets? Silence. Mason. I was trying to protect myself. There was the truth. Not the whole truth. But enough. I asked him why he had let everyone believe he had nothing. He said he was scared. He said the business was failing faster than he expected. He said he thought if he could protect certain assets he might eventually recover. Then I asked, so why did you need my bakery? His voice became quieter. Because you could afford to help. I closed my eyes. That sentence told me everything. They weren't looking at me as a daughter. They were looking at me as an emergency account. I told Mason I wouldn't discuss anything else until everything was documented properly. He begged me not to involve lawyers. That confirmed my decision. I wasn't going to let emotion decide what happened next. I went back to my attorney and handed over everything. The security footage. The note. The messages. The purchase records. The information about Mason's transferred assets. My attorney told me we needed to separate what we could prove from what we suspected. So we did. And that distinction became incredibly important. Because within days the story my parents had been telling everyone began to fall apart. They had told relatives that Mason was completely broke. They had told people I was refusing to help him even though I could save him. But now I had documentation showing that Mason had moved valuable assets before the crisis became public. And I had proof that my parents had entered my business and removed property without my authorization. Still, I didn't confront them. Not yet. I knew they were expecting me to explode. They expected tears. They expected screaming. They expected me to call them and beg them to bring my equipment back. Instead, I opened the bakery's front door the next morning. The room was almost empty. But I stood behind the counter anyway. I made 1 cup of coffee. Then I pulled out a notebook and wrote down everything I needed to rebuild. Not everything I had lost. Everything I still had. My name. My recipes. My customers. My business records. My experience. And the truth. That was when I realized something my parents hadn't considered. They could take my ovens. They could empty my shelves. They could damage a room. But they couldn't take away the years I'd spent learning how to build a business. And they certainly couldn't erase the evidence they had left behind. I looked at the empty kitchen and whispered to myself, you wanted me to choose between family and my future. I closed the notebook. You should have realized I can choose my future without destroying anyone. What I didn't know yet was that Mason was about to make one mistake that would put the final piece of the puzzle directly into my hands. That final piece of the puzzle arrived sooner than I expected. The next afternoon Mason sent me a message. He didn't call. He didn't ask to meet. He simply wrote, please don't send anything to my attorney yet. I can explain everything. I stared at the screen. My attorney. Not the attorney. My attorney. That told me Mason knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded the message to my attorney and waited. Less than an hour later, Mason called. Peyton, please answer. I picked up. What do you want? I made mistakes. You did. I was trying to protect what I had left. From whom? He hesitated. From the creditors. I leaned back in my chair. So you did move the assets? I had to. No, Mason. You wanted to. He started explaining that his business had been failing for months. He said he knew the situation was getting worse and was terrified of losing everything. I asked him why he hadn't told our parents the truth. He said they knew enough. That answer made me laugh bitterly. They knew enough to come into my bakery and take my equipment. I didn't tell them to do that. But you knew they were planning to use my bakery. Another silence. Then he said something I'll never forget. They said you wouldn't really let me lose everything. There was the sentence that finally exposed the entire family dynamic. They had counted on my guilt. They had counted on my history. They had counted on the fact that I was always the responsible daughter. And Mason had believed it too. I asked him one last question. If you had assets you were protecting, why did you let Mom and Dad tell me you had nothing? His voice dropped. Because if you knew, you wouldn't help. I closed my eyes. For years, I had wondered why Mason always seemed to escape the consequences of his choices. Now I understood. He didn't escape them. He transferred them. First to our parents. Then to me. I told him the conversation was over. He panicked. Peyton, wait. Please. Don't make this worse. I didn't make this worse. You're my sister. And you're the person who let them believe my bakery should pay for your decisions. He said nothing. I ended the call. From that point forward, everything moved quickly. My attorney helped me separate the facts from the family drama. That mattered. I didn't want revenge based on anger. I wanted the truth documented properly. The bakery equipment had been purchased by my business. The lease was in my name. My parents had no ownership interest. The security footage showed them entering. My mother's messages showed they had discussed removing equipment. And Mason's own message established that he knew my parents were planning to pressure me. There was another piece too. The financial records surrounding Mason's business raised serious questions about where certain assets had gone before the collapse. I didn't need to guess anymore. The documents spoke for themselves. My parents, however, still thought they could control the story. Mom called me one evening. Her voice was unusually gentle. Peyton, sweetheart, let's stop fighting. I almost smiled. Fighting? You know what I mean. No, Mom. I don't. She said the family had been under enormous pressure. She said everyone had made mistakes. Then she said the sentence I knew was coming. You need to think about your brother. I looked around my nearly empty bakery. I have thought about him. And I still won't pay his debt. She sighed. Your father, and I thought you would understand. I understand perfectly. He started crying. You've changed. No, Mom. I just stopped saying yes. That silenced her. For years, yes had been my role. Yes, I'll help. Yes, I'll lend it. Yes, I'll cover it. Yes, I'll come over. Yes, I'll fix it. This time the answer was no. Mom eventually said they would return what they could. I told her that wasn't enough. The equipment had to be accounted for properly, and everything else would be handled through the appropriate process. She accused me of treating my own parents like strangers. I answered quietly. You treated my business like it belonged to the family. Then I ended the call. A week later, the family finally sat down together. My parents. Me. I brought a folder. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No speech rehearsed in front of a mirror. Just documents. My father looked at the folder and immediately became defensive. What is this? The truth. Mason looked nervous. Mom wouldn't look at me. I placed the first document on the table. This is the bakery lease. Then the purchase records. These show who paid for the equipment. Then the security footage. This shows who entered the bakery. My father shifted in his chair. I placed copies of messages beside them. And these show that you discussed taking my equipment before you entered. Mom started crying. We were trying to help Mason. I looked at her. You weren't helping him. She wiped her eyes. You don't understand. I understand more than you think. Then I turned to Mason. You told me you were broke. He looked down. You told Mom and Dad you had nothing. He stayed silent. You told everyone I was the only person who could save you. His shoulders dropped. Then I placed the records showing the transfers in front of him. But you were protecting assets before the collapse. My father looked at Mason. Is this true? Mason didn't answer. That silence was enough. Dad's face changed. For the first time he wasn't looking at me as the difficult daughter. He was looking at his son. "What did you do?" Mason started explaining. He said he had panicked. He said he never intended for things to get this bad. He said he thought he could fix everything. Mom immediately tried to defend him. He was scared. I looked at her. I was scared too. She stopped. I was scared when I opened my bakery and didn't know if I'd make payroll. I was scared when I signed my first lease. I was scared when I had to choose between paying myself and paying a supplier. I looked around the table. But I didn't make everyone else pay for those fears. Nobody spoke. Then my father asked the question I had been waiting for. "What do you want?" I could have asked for an apology. I could have demanded money. I could have humiliated Mason. But I wanted something simpler. "I want my business back." My father nodded slowly. "And I want everyone to understand that my bakery is not a family emergency fund." Mason looked at me. I understand. I wasn't sure he did. But it was his responsibility to learn. The equipment situation was handled through the proper channels, and I began replacing what I needed. I didn't try to recreate the bakery exactly as it had been. I changed things. I replaced the old layout. I updated security. I changed access. I stopped giving relatives keys. And most importantly, I stopped mixing family loyalty with business decisions. The first morning I reopened, I arrived before sunrise. The bakery smelled like coffee and fresh bread again. There were still empty spaces where some of my old equipment had been. There were marks on the walls that hadn't been repaired yet. But customers started walking through the door. One woman looked around and said, "I'm so glad you're back." I smiled. So am I. By the end of the morning we had sold more than I expected. I stood behind the counter watching my employees work, and for the first time since the destruction, I felt something other than anger. I felt proud. Not because my parents had been exposed. Not because Mason had to face his own financial problems. Because I had rebuilt something they thought they had taken from me. A few weeks later, my mother asked to meet me alone. We sat at a small cafe. She looked tired. "I owe you an apology," she said. I didn't interrupt. She admitted that she had spent years protecting Mason because she believed he needed her more. "And you," she said, "always seemed so strong." I looked down at my coffee. Being strong doesn't mean I didn't need my mother. Her eyes filled with tears. I know that now. I believed she was sorry. But forgiveness wasn't something I could give just because someone finally understood what they had done. "I don't hate you, Mom," I said. She reached across the table. "But things can't go back to the way they were." She nodded. "I understand." That was enough for that day. I went back to the bakery afterward. I unlocked the door myself. I walked through the kitchen. The ovens were running. The mixers were turning. Customers were laughing in the front room. And I realized something. My parents had believed they were taking away my power when they emptied my bakery. They were wrong. They had only shown me exactly where my boundaries needed to be. Mason still had a $1.5 million problem. My parents still had to live with the choices they made. But neither of those things belonged to me anymore. For the first time, I wasn't carrying someone else's consequences. I was carrying my own future. And that was worth more than anything they had taken. I used to believe being a good daughter meant saying yes, even when saying yes was costing me everything. But losing my bakery taught me something I should have learned years earlier. Family should never demand that you destroy your future to protect someone else's choices. Mason had to face his $1.5 million debt, my parents had to face what they had done, and I had to rebuild what they thought they could take from me. If Peyton's story reminded you that boundaries aren't betrayal, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, would you have helped Mason or would you have said no too?